Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, together with my co-host Mark Ronich of Statewide News Service, jbiztechvalley.com. As you can see here, columnist for the Jewish Press.
And I'm having a great time doing all of those assignments, and my column in Jewish Press is the Albany Beat, and I talk about how government relates to the Jewish community or doesn't, as the case may be. But today we're going to have a history lesson today.
There you go.
And with us is the Albany City historian, Tony Opalka. Welcome to the Jewish View.
Thank you, gentlemen.
And I understand you prepared something special. As Albany City historian, you deal with many cultures, Italian, Irish, Dutch, but you got something special for the Jewish community.
I do.
So,
yeah, a few years back, there was a history fair, and the presentation was about the South End and the Jewish community of Albany. And the two are so intertwined that you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. But the South End, as we remember it, of course, is the 20th century, maybe even late 19th, but the Jewish community in Albany goes back more than 300 years to the 1650s, when the first Jews arrived in New Amsterdam. And they had left Europe during the Spanish Inquisition, went to Brazil, and then finally ended up in the New World. And the Dutch were reputedly very tolerant of other religious organizations, so they found a home here in New Netherland, New York City, of course, called New Amsterdam at the time, and Albany, called Beverwyck at the time. And later, about 10 years after the first arrived, the English took over the Dutch claims and changed the name of Beverwyck to Albany. So that's the city that we know now.
Was it Fort Orange?
Fort Orange was a trading post that was located about at the foot of Madison Avenue. That was a very small trading post.
Okay, so the city of Albany was never called Fort Orange?
That's correct.
Okay. Because that's a misnomer.
Well, it's a kind of a confusing history, because there was Fort Orange, which was simply a trading post where I would imagine most of the residents were men. They came over, trapped furs, and because beaver pelts were very much in demand in Holland and Europe generally, and probably were never expected to stay permanently. In 1630, the patroon system was set up, and that was a series of large landholdings that lined the Hudson River, and the most successful one was the Van Rensselaer patroonship, which was the one around here. And the story goes that the fort, there were too many people that wanted to be in the fort, so they began building on the outside of the fort. And the Van Rensselaers said, but wait a minute, if you're building outside the fort, then you're tenant farmers, you're not Dutch West India Company people, so you have to pay us rent. And a dispute ensued, and Peter Stuyvesant solved the dispute in 1652. The way it's told is that he shot a cannon in 3 directions from Fort Orange, and where those cannonballs fell were the jurisdiction of the Dutch West India Company. And beyond that was the Van Rensselaer colony, where the tenant farmers had to pay an annual rent. So what he set up in 1652 was the village of Beverwyck. And
Which is now what?
we're pretty much downtown. It was,
Albany.
yes, it's centered kind of at State and Pearl, Broadway, up the hill a little bit, about halfway up the hill, a little bit above Pearl Street. And eventually, in 1664, when the English took over all Dutch claims, the stockade was sort of a pentagon shape from about the middle of the State Street Hill to Broadway to about Steuben Street and Hudson Avenue. And that kept expanding throughout the 18th century. And but at the time of 1664, Beverwyck was changed to Albany.
They have a Fort Orange. Who were they afraid of? Some European country invading them, or the Native Americans?
Well, yes, it was probably a little bit of both. It's an interesting concept because the English and French empires kind of met somewhere north of Albany, and that's where they expected conflict, because the French were settling Quebec and kind of coming down
Well, it was like Lake
the river.
Champlain. Around
Lake
Whitehall,
Champlain.
around
Well,
Whitehall.
coincidentally, Henry Hudson
Yeah.
and Champlain sailed at the same time.
Right.
But I think they probably got within 50 miles of each other,
Didn't know.
but neither one was aware of the other. So the claim for New France was to the north, the claim for Holland was to the south. Then, of course, when the English took over, the Dutch were out of the picture, but the English and French empires were in conflict
Okay, now
right
Peter
here.
Stuyvesant, you mentioned him earlier. He was like the governor of New York City.
He was governor of the New Netherland colony.
Right, which is but down in New York City.
Right, he was housed in
And-
New Amsterdam.
And he wasn't very friendly to the Jews.
That I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know if I've ever
And
come
that's-
across that.
And he was very, and that was my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of Jews wanted to get out of the area, and and Asser Levy was one of the traders, like he said, beaver
Okay,
pelts,
mhm.
and he came up
Here where he
came
found a
up here.
friendlier environment.
And then he turned around and started to have other Jews come with him, but they wanted a minyan, a group of 10 men above 13, to pray. And so he started like the first minyan here in Albany.
Okay.
And
And that's in the 1650s?
And that was
then,
in the early
Yeah.
mid-1600s, right? And
Yeah.
so was that trading idea that we really started having Jews here in
Yep.
Albany.
mhm.
You know, let me ask you, it's a little bit of going to the future, but it always intrigued me. You know, of course, we live here in the Albany Capital District, and, you know, you meet so many people, of course I do, in the Jewish community, and everybody's from the mass immigration, which is 1880 to 1920,
Sure.
for the most part.
Right.
You got the modern
Right.
Russian Jews
Yep.
and people coming
Sure.
after the Holocaust. But, you know, you never meet anybody who says, you know, hey, why don't there's a family that, we trace ourselves back to the 1600s, to the 1700s, and I never met anybody like that.
Well, there's really, I mean, it seems to be that they either went underground or kind of disappeared for almost 200 years, and then really you see in the 1840s the beginning of the German Jewish immigration. And that's when the first synagogue was actually established in 1838 with German-speaking Jews.
And that was, which synagogue was that?
That was Congregation Bethel,
Okay.
and again in the South End, and the South
Do you know
End.
what street that was
That
on?
was that was on Bassett Street, and
That's
I
66 Bassett?
yeah I don't believe the building still exists.
No.
I think it has to do with number changes and things like that. There is a building somewhere in that vicinity, but I'm sure
No,
that's
when I-
not the
when I
original building.
Researched this, I found out that that they blocked off that part of Bassett Street heading west.
Okay.
And that used to go through, and it's blocked off, and that's where it was.
Yeah. It's hard to know, where so much has changed in the
Because
South
Bassett
End.
ends at 787.
Right,
in
and
the
then
cen-
South
right.
Pearl on the other end.
Right.
Yeah. So
it's
it's part of
it's somewhere in there.
Somewhere in there.
So you got a 3-block
Yeah.
radius to
Right.
figure it out where
Right.
it was. So you know approximately.
Yeah, it was on Bassett Street.
Right.
We know that much. So that was a German-speaking congregation,
Right.
and the Russian and Eastern European Jews, other Eastern European countries, they really came starting in the 1880s, and the
Well,
South End
I thought the Poles came in 1880s. Russians came in 1900 or whatever.
That could be. Yep.
Okay.
I'm afraid I may not have the exact dates other than Eastern European. What's interesting is that my personal roots are there. My mother's parents came from Italy. And so I was able to find my mother in the 1925 census. And it was clear the state took a census every 10 years on the 5 years. So you could look at the 05, 15, and 25 census records. And I was absolutely convinced that there was no English spoken east of South Pearl Street because all the adults were from Europe. They were either listed as Russia
Right.
for the Jews or Italy for the Italians. And they were very much intermingled.
It's just always known that, maybe you can speak about that, the Italian and Jewish neighborhoods whenever there's a map of, like I know in the State Museum, this
Yeah.
is in New York City.
Sure.
These were the communities. You always know. I mean, we just lived it also in Jewish community in Chicago. The Italians and the Jews got along.
Yeah, it
the
seems
best.
that way. And, you know, you look at the names in the census, and they're living among each other, you know, either in the same building or certainly on the same streets, and shopping in each other's stores and all that. I mean, my mother spoke of, you know, her father going to Jewish stores along South Pearl Street, and probably other parts of the neighborhood as well.
So let me just ask you about the congregation Bethel, and then there was Bethel Jacob.
Yeah, and they, interestingly enough, they were only 3 years apart.
Right, okay.
Bethel being 1838, Bethel Jacob, formed by 3 members and 8 seat holders of Bethel, splitting off for religious reasons a more stringent Orthodox
Right.
orientation for Bethel Jacob. And apparently Bethel used the German rite, whereas Bethel Jacob used the Polish rite. So I think that goes along with what you said earlier about the Poles being the first,
The second
wave of the Eastern, the first of the Eastern Europeans, but the second wave of Jews after the
Right.
Germans.
And so there were 2 similarly named synagogues,
Yep.
Bethel and Bethel Jacob.
Mhm.
I mean, they couldn't come up with some other name. You know? And then there was later on United Brethren, which was Agudas Achim. And was
Yeah.
that the Russian?
I
one?
believe so, yeah. Let me
Okay.
just check my notes here. Yeah, that was an Orthodox congregation, and I'm going to guess by 1902 that would have been, when that was formed, that would have been
Right.
a Russian congregation.
My notes say that by the 1880s, the arrival of Jews from the Russian Empire expanded the Jewish population to 3,000. Further immigration of Russian and Polish-speaking Jews increased the community to 4,000 in 1900, 10,000 in 1920s. So this is all in Albany.
Sure,
Just
and-
Albany,
yeah, and that would figure, and probably the vast majority of them were in the South End.
No, they were all in the
Yeah,
South End,
where
yeah.
they came. There is, I mean, it's a great immigration history in the South End because it really did illustrate the waves of succession, of immigrant succession, that reflected the national trends. In Albany, you know, you had Dutch. Maybe you didn't have that in other parts of the East Coast, but Dutch and English first, followed by German and Irish, followed by Italians and Jews, followed by African Americans. So that part of the South End that we now call the Pastors area, for example, that's a microcosm of what happened
Internationally,
nationally.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
You know, let me ask you, just interesting, because I love history, but are you paid, I mean, what's your position? You're a paid, and it's just like every city has a historian.
Well, the New York State, I'm not sure how many other states in the country have this, but New York State law, education law, requires each municipality to have a historian. And there are something like 1,500 municipalities in the state.
What's a municipality? Like every little
Municipality,
city?
Village,
every
town.
village, town, city,
City.
and county.
Really?
Not a
Yes.
hamlet. It has
No,
to
a
be
hamlet is part of a
of
town,
or a
probably,
village,
yeah.
right.
Yeah. So each one of those municipalities is supposed to have a historian. They're theoretically supposed to be paid. They're theoretically supposed to have an office. And
So what's the theory here in Albany City?
well, the theory here in Albany City is I get a stipend of $2,000 a year, and I have
At one point, that was worth a lot.
Right,
And you're
yeah.
a historian, so you can figure out how far
And-
back that
You
is.
don't live in
And-
1920.
No,
though,
don't quit the day job. But no, it was funny because I was
Paying your
looking for
1880
something.
salaries.
Right, I was looking for something, another research line I was pursuing, and I found in the 1930s the city historian got paid $1,300 in the 1930s. I think that was more than today, but you don't do this for the money, that's for
No,
sure.
that's for
You do it because you're passionate about Albany history.
And you were giving walking tours, right?
Walking tours this morning, I actually gave a bus tour with a couple of people from Historic Albany Foundation to some university, University at Albany officials. And we did a 3-hour all you can ever imagine about Albany on a bus.
So you took them down to the south end?
Yes, we went all the way, we started at the university, we went all the way down to Cherry Hill, down on South Pearl Street, Schuyler Mansion, through Green Street and the Pastures area, through downtown, over to Tenbrook Street, the Tenbrook Mansion, and so on. It was kind of like, here's a little taste, please come back and explore more.
So since we got off topic, I just wanted to ask you, there's the Opalka Gallery.
No relation.
Oh, really?
Right.
Because it's not a very common
No, it's not. Well,
name.
actually, I found out relatively recently that it's more common than we had always thought.
Okay.
The benefactor of the Opalka Gallery is from Amsterdam,
New York.
which Amsterdam has another large Slavic population. It's a Slavic name, and I finally met him for the first time just a few months back, and he told me that there were 7 Opalka families in Amsterdam, and he was only related to one other. But more recently, I found out that my grandparents came from the Carpathian Mountains, and when Poland was partitioned in 1772, they took a census, and the village where my grandfather came from had 5 Opalka families in it, and there were a few others from other parts of Galicia that came over. I guess they came over here. My grandfather came over in 1908 and settled near Watervliet, which the Troy, Watervliet, Cohoes area had a Slavic population as well. And so they found like-minded people who spoke their language.
Just for another historical note, the Hasidic movement of Judas is founded in the Carpathian Mountains.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Eastern
Well,
Europe.
one funny little thing, my grandfather's name was Jacob, and
First name or last name?
The
first name.
Oh, yeah.
And in the ship manifest, he was listed as Hebrew, and I don't think he was Jewish because he
Why do you think
joined a
Why
Christian
did
church.
they-
I assume it was because his name was Jacob. They thought
They
that
just
was
assumed Jacob is a Jew guy.
a Jewish name, yeah. And interestingly, speaking of the South End, my mother, when she got married, moved to the area where my father was from, and there was a Russian Orthodox church there, and it was the first time she ever knew that Russians weren't always Jewish, because all the Russians that she knew in the South End were Jewish.
Right.
So I guess, if you don't travel around much, you learn things as you do.
And when you talked about Watervliet, Troy, Cohoes area, Cohoes and Troy had very large Jewish populations at that time. So
Yeah, and there are, I don't know the exact number, but there were a number of synagogues in Troy as well.
yeah, there's 3 in Troy and a Chabad house around the universities. But Cohoes used to have some synagogues.
Yeah,
But
and there's nothing there now, I
No,
don't think.
there's
is there?
nothing there
No.
now, but the interiors of the artifacts within the synagogue were sent to the Troy
Oh, is that right?
Orthodox Synagogue
Okay.
on Ferry Street, is it?
Rivers.
River Street.
River Street, oh, okay, I know
yeah.
the building, sure.
Yeah.
And that's still functioning.
It is.
Yeah.
Let me ask you something. I'm always going to the present, but I love history, but I know the history to the present.
Yeah.
I mean, is part of your job maybe to write, the history ongoing of Albany? I mean, like this neighborhood's changing, and, like you're saying, a synagogue here and maybe a church there. Do you have documentation?
Like
It's
they're
not just
closing a lot
studying
of
the
churches
past.
now,
Right,
so-
right. Well, I do write articles for a neighborhood magazine, and I approached the editor and said, what would you think if I did you ever wonder ...
Right.
And I would pose a question and then answer it. And it's everything from why there are a lot of streets named after birds in Albany to
Wood Street, Norwood.
the woods
Yeah,
off
the
New
woods,
Scotland. I
yeah.
haven't tackled that one
Hollywood.
yet. That's definitely an interesting story there. To what's the oldest building in a particular neighborhood,
ask you about
to any kind of, I could dream up the topics, or people write in and say, could he talk about this or that? So
It's interesting, you talk about the oldest building, what about the Saul where you...
Well, that's what I was
stand?
gonna, that's
All right,
Yes.
I saw you, it was such a good meeting, we both have seen it.
Yes, we
So
just went
it's-
past that on the bus this morning.
Yeah, so there was a controversy about which was the oldest
Yes.
building based on the boundary of where Albany used to be and where
Right.
it is now.
Well, it's
So
an
it-
interesting question, okay. Okay, I mentioned earlier about Stuyvesant's cannonballs. When the city was set up and when the city was chartered in 1686, they used the limits of Beverwyck as the city limits, except that rather than kind of this sort of half circle around the fort, they went in 16 miles, which I think was to kind of capture Schenectady into the jurisdiction of Albany. They didn't quite make it all the way to Schenectady, but it went way beyond the settled area of the city. And so when the first annexation was 1815, and that was north of the city line. The city line at that time on the north was Clinton Avenue. So the building at 48 Hudson, which was last the Saul Equipment Company, was built within city limits, and it's dated through tree ring dating to 1728. The former building holding that record, which may be the same age or thereabouts, is the Quackenbush House. That has never been tree ring dated in the same way that 48 Hudson Avenue was. But that was actually built outside city limits. So that's still, splitting hairs here. 48 Hudson was always within city limits. If it's the same age as the Quackenbush House, well, one was built outside city limits and one was built within city
just again,
limits.
So
the
what's the
president-
verdict, Mr. Historian?
I'm not going to take a stand
Why
on
not? No one's around anymore.
Well, you got the-
Oh, there are people
Now
around
you're on
who
the
are very...
Jewish, but now you're on the Jewish view, so I would say.
But do you think only Jews are
48
going to watch this show? I will not take a stand on that. I will say that it is possible that the buildings are close, very close in age.
Okay.
And, but there has been no tree ring dating of
Okay.
the
And the
Quackenbush House.
Quackenbush House is still in use.
Yeah, we had lunch there, as a matter of fact, on the
And-
bus tour today.
The
That's-
Hudson, some
And
is.
and Saul is not, the Saul building.
Right,
is-
Hudson,
like a wreck right now.
the Saul Equipment Company is now owned by Historic Albany Foundation.
Really, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they are not sure what's going to happen to it. I mean, it's not going to be demolished,
No.
but its eventual use has not yet been
But it
They
could
put
be
determined.
them on.
moved. They could jack it up.
Well,
and
I
move it.
think they would probably like to see it stay where it is
Oh.
because that's part of the significance of the building is that it was built
But
on
it's
that
interesting how
location.
everything, there's nothing like really around it.
There's nothing around
When
it.
you come over the South Mall Expressway, you can see
Right, you
this
see.
one building
Right.
that just stands
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
and you don't know why.
Yeah, and for very recent history, that was the area where the convention center
That's
was
right.
going to be built. And it still would be possible, of course, that could be a welcome center to Albany. Really, the
be
jury is out
interesting,
on
yeah.
that.
Be an
Interesting to have
interesting
the
thing.
oldest building in the city
As the welcome
become
center.
the welcome center.
Well, right now,
would be
they
great.
don't have plans to renovate it. 'cause
Well,
I guess it
it's
looks like a wreck
stabilized.
now.
Yeah, it's stabilized, and that means that it's kind of mothballed until they figure out. They don't want to put a lot of, effort into it if the use is going to be changed or if something is going to be changed.
No,
on
another
it.
thing, I actually live in Bethlehem. They said that Bethlehem borders was really right into Albany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Can you talk about that?
yeah. The southern boundary of Albany was between the Schuyler Mansion and Cherry Hill, just about at the northern boundary of the Port of Albany. That was the other place where the cannonball fell. And so that was how the boundaries were set. The southern boundary, there was a major annexation to the south in 1870, and that's when it was moved further south, almost to the Normanskill. And then in 1910, there was another annexation, and 1967, yet another. So now the southern boundary is the Normanskill.
And that's the boundary, but that's on the south side, you said. But on the west side, going out into Scotland,
Yeah.
Road or New Scotland Avenue.
Yep.
That also, there used to be Klarsfeld,
Right. Well, that was the 67 annexation.
but that was
That was in Bethlehem until 67.
Klarsfeld was
Yep.
Bethlehem. But I was told, and maybe you can verify it or dispute it, that because of the South Mall took away so much property, that they pushed back the Bethlehem line to add more tax base.
Well, that could be, but
To
the
make up.
annexation laws of the state were such that the people who lived in that area had to vote to come
Right.
into the city.
And I was told that it was because they could get water lines.
Right, water and sewer are always a big one.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, in the early days, that was, city services were desirable, and rural towns didn't have them.
Right.
So,
So they voted to
come into the city.
Come into the city,
Mhm.
and again, that's the Norman skill, I believe,
Right.
also on
Yep.
that side.
It is.
So
Yep.
it's the boundary is further
Yep.
west, I guess.
Right, or whatever, I always get
Yeah.
confused, south, west, whatever it is.
So that
there.
was so that's where that border changed going out
Mhm.
towards the Bethlehem Slingland's Price Chopper.
Right, and that, yeah.
But up until about 10 years ago, I believe that there was still a sign up that said Klarsfeld.
There is, there might even still be one here now.
And they have this
A fire
firehouse
department, yeah.
That's the Slingland's Fire Department that's still in
exactly.
the city of Albany.
Exactly.
line.
Yep.
And it's
From
near
that
where,
area?
and it's
Yep.
near where Mayor Jennings lives.
Right. Yep.
Former Mayor Jennings.
Mhm.
And Jerry was saying how he wishes that building could be moved because every time the bells go off, he gets wakened, and-
Yeah, is that still a Slingerland's
Yeah.
Fire Department? So
Yeah.
they come and
From Albany.
They
come into Albany and drive their fire trucks
Right.
out to Slingerland's.
Yeah, it's
And
still
that's
operating.
covered, yeah, and that of course is covered by the city fire department, the area
Right.
up to the Normanskill.
Right.
So it is kind of a funny,
About your
funny
pictures
thing.
about old Albany?
Pardon me?
We would like to see some pictures of
Well, we
old
did.
Albany.
They were,
All right.
the screen went off.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Oh, okay, yeah, I
but
can't,
as we
oh,
were talking about the different synagogues,
mhm,
and,
yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, and of course, Ohav Shalom is in that area that was in Bethlehem until the early 20th century,
where was Ohio?
on Crumkill Road.
The 85.
Right.
The
right
new
off the
one, the
85.
new, not the one on Washington Avenue, but the one that
That used
they
to be,
moved.
that's the area you're talking about that was annexed from
Yes.
Bethlehem
So
and
that was
Albany.
originally Bethlehem.
Right.
And then when the boundaries got changed, it was in Albany.
Yes, I think that the boundary there is a little confusing, and I can't remember exactly how it ran. That may have been built in Albany.
Yeah, I think.
And then other parts of the area came in from Bethlehem after
Right.
the synagogue and the apartments were built.
Clemkill Road.
Yeah.
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 So can we go back to the 18?
Sure.
Going back in history,
We
always has
digressed a
stories.
little bit,
Yeah.
that's for sure.
I just,
Make it always modern.
I just
All right.
wanted to point out that, while we had a minyan in the early days
Mhm.
from Asa Levy,
Yep.
we didn't really have a formal rabbinate
Mhm.
up until
Till the
Up
1830s.
until the 1830s.
Mhm.
So it
Yeah.
was a loosely defined Jewish community,
Mhm.
but still, the first rabbi was in Albany.
The first rabbi, was he the first? You're talking about Isaac Mayer Wise?
Was he the first?
Was he the
I-
first? He came in
It
1846.
says okay, yeah, 1848 or
So,
46.
yeah, so would there have been, if they founded an
It says here
actual...
he became Albany's first rabbi when he took over leadership of Bethel in
Okay,
1846.
all right. So what would have happened between 1838 and 1846?
The Jews ran themselves already.
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe,
everyone was a rabbi.
Okay. So,
And, and everyone knew.
Every
Well,
Jew is a rabbi. A lot of Jews want to
But
be.
did you know the conflict of why the break-off?
Yes.
And tell us
and
about
it
that.
had to do with, he was the first reform. No, he founded the reform movement
Well,
pretty
he
much.
was-
Is that?
yes, he-
is that?
he-
I don't want to misuse
He
terms. So
founded the American reform movement.
Okay.
It was in Europe,
okay.
but he brought those ideas over with
Okay.
him from Europe.
Mhm.
And what happened was that Bethel Jacob, he wanted more what they call modern at the time way of running services. So
Mhm.
on Rosh Hashanah, the first day when they went up to take out the Torahs,
Mhm.
the Holy Scrolls, he wanted it done one way, and the current congregants at that time wanted it a different way, the way they're used to.
Mhm.
And they didn't want this change that he just demanded right on the spot. So they got into this pushing match and this fight that rolled out into the street.
Yep.
And the police came.
Yep.
And they broke up the fight, and that was the end of services.
Mhm.
And they didn't have another day of Rosh Hashanah. The community was totally split.
Mhm.
And by Yom Kippur, he had started up his own congregation.
Mhm.
And that became Beth Emeth,
Okay. And yeah,
which was the fourth Reformed synagogue in the country.
Yeah, my notes here say he wanted mixed seating of men and women,
Right.
a mixed choir with hymns in German and English, deletion of certain prayers to shorten
Don't get shaky here.
No, is this true? I mean,
No,
this
it's
is
true. What you're saying.
but
It's
you
just
know,
not my way of Judaism. That's what he's saying. We
Um,
say a little English in our synagogue.
We do.
well, but this is 150
No, but he
years
wanted
ago.
mixed
right?
seating. I thought you were going to fall out of the
Yeah.
seat.
That's the reformers,
So-
reformer conservative.
So-
have that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he formed Anshe Emeth in 1851.
Right.
Yeah, and then they bought a former church on South Pearl Street, and apparently too he was the first one to use pews in a service so that people actually sat. So before that, people stood for the entire
No,
service.
Bethel
Is that-
Jacob has pews.
Oh, okay, but it did
And
it from the.
upstairs, they still have the nameplates on the back of the
Yep.
pews of people who bought their seats
Yeah.
From 1800s?
in the 1800s.
But what year was it? After 1851?
No,
Oh, before that. Okay.
right. It was the original plates, and you know the stained glass windows that are in the Herkimer Street Synagogue are, you know, I'm trying to get them removed and replaced, and it's costing $50,000 just to do that. But it's another $50,000 that the church elders want to get the property, to
Yeah.
receive the property. So
Right.
you try to raise $100,000, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
So
No.
anyway,
Yeah,
I'm
the building
putting
is
that
for
pitch-
sale now.
Well, the
No.
building's for sale, which is more a reason why we should take
Right.
that back into the
Right.
Jewish communities.
Do you think that would really happen?
Well, take the glass.
Oh, take the
stained
glass, certainly, yeah.
And all
Yeah.
the interior stuff back into the
Yeah.
Jewish community.
I mean, that would be terrific.
And then we can give it to, or, make deals with the people whose names are affiliated or associated with those names. And their
Yeah.
ancestors are still here.
Yeah, I don't think we can really skip a discussion of Beth Emeth at Swan Street, because that's one of the most amazing buildings in Albany.
Right, it's now the Wilborn Temple.
Wilborn Temple, but designed by a member of the congregation named, Abraham Fleischman, and his consulting architect was Isaac Perry, who was the architect of the Capitol, working on the Capitol
One
in the
of the three.
last year. One of the many, yeah. He was the last one, and he became the state architect, and probably his most well-known building in Albany is the Washington Avenue Armory.
Right.
And
But
he helped to design Beth Emeth?
yes,
The
he
Wilborn
and,
Temple
he and,
down
he and
there.
Abraham Fleischman yeah.
The one
Yeah.
on Academy Road was.
Percival Goodman in the 1950s.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was built by Lou Swire, which
Right.
of course everyone in Albany would know the name Lou Swire. But that's the building that replaced the Swan Street
Yes.
building in the 50s.
And H.H. Richardson, I thought, had some.
Well, Richardson was a very influential architect, and he was actually one of the architects of the Capitol,
Right.
as well as the architect of City Hall.
Right.
But his influence on American architecture was really tremendous, and the Beth Emeth building is very much in the style of H.H. Richardson. You'll notice a lot of features that would remind you of City Hall, with the arched openings on the
Right.
Lancaster Street side, the corner tower, the use of the heavy sandstone. Those are features that are known as Richardsonian Romanesque.
I thought he had some role in the synagogue, in designing.
I
some
don't
synagogue.
think so, because the history of the Capitol was so confusing. So many things were going on.
Right.
That building dates from 1885. Richardson died in 1886, and I think he was long out of Albany by the time that he died. But his influence
Right.
on that architectural style was certainly tremendous. That's probably one of the most
You
notable
know,
buildings.
we're out of time, unfortunately, because it's really so interesting and could talk another few hours. So we'll have to have you back. But we just want to thank you, Tony, for being on the
Well,
Jewish View.
you're welcome.
And dealing with history, because I really feel that history is important. As Jewish history is important. Everybody's history. You don't know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from.
Right.
And continue with your good work.
I'm glad we
Okay.
got this on the record.
Well, thank you.
And especially
Thanks
the
for having
cannonball
me.
story.
Right.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
there are some interesting stories for sure.
Thanks for the time.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.